General Hospital will reveal Michael's sudden and unanticipated return to Port Charles sent shockwaves through the carefully laid plans that had once favored Willow in the ongoing custody battle over Wiley and Amelia. What had been a delicate balance, teetering but intact, was shattered in a matter of moments the instant Michael walked back into the courtroom and into the lives of the children he had once been forced to leave behind. Willow, who had tried so desperately to maintain her composure, who had fought to believe that her version of family could withstand the scrutiny of the legal system, now found herself drowning in panic. The vision of a future where Wiley and Amelia were hers to raise in peace had been her anchor, her only thread of hope in an otherwise chaotic emotional storm. But that thread was unraveling, and fast. Drew, the man who had stood beside her during Michael's absence, who had whispered reassurances and made vows of protection, could feel the ground shifting beneath them. He had promised Willow security, he had sworn that nothing, no one, would take her children away. And now, with Michael's return, Drew's calm exterior began to splinter under the pressure of promises he feared he could no longer keep. What began as a protective instinct mutated into something darker and far more dangerous. His mind, once strategic and composed, became a hive of frantic calculations, ominous projections, and a growing obsession to preserve control at any cost. To Drew, this wasn't about legal custody anymore, it was about erasing the threat, obliterating the possibility that Willow might lose the very children who had become the center of both their lives. As the legal proceedings intensified, so did Drew's sense of powerlessness. He watched Rick, their defense attorney, lay out every argument, every detail, with clinical precision. But for Drew, none of it felt enough. He no longer trusted the legal process. Despite Rick's reassurances, despite his intricate litigation strategies, Drew couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a losing battle. Michael's reputation, once tarnished by his absence, was now being polished and re-established with every court appearance. He was calm, articulate, emotionally resonant, everything a judge wanted in a father. Drew saw clearly what no one else would admit: Michael wasn't just back, he was winning. And if something drastic wasn't done, all their efforts would be rendered meaningless. Initially, Drew clung to the idea that there might be a legal loophole, a hidden skeleton in Michael's closet. He pressured Rick to dig deeper, to uncover something, anything, that might undermine Michael's image. But no matter how hard they searched, they found nothing. Michael was clean. His past was one of consistent devotion to his children, his present a story of redemption. There were no financial misdeeds, no hidden addictions, no criminal affiliations that could be exploited. Drew's desperation began to fester. He urged Rick to consider under-the-table tactics, including bribing the judge. Rick balked, visibly disturbed by the suggestion, and warned Drew not to cross lines that could destroy them all. But to Drew, Rick's refusal wasn't prudence, it was weakness. He couldn't afford weakness anymore. Each passing day hardened Drew's resolve. The more Willow unraveled, the more he believed that the legal route was a dead end. The realization took root like a weed: he couldn't save Willow and the children by playing fair. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was late at night. Willow sat alone in the kitchen, shoulders shaking, tears soaking into her hands. She had tried to stay strong. But the thought of losing Wiley and Amelia was destroying her from the inside out. Drew stood silently in the hallway, watching her crumble. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter all their lives. He would do the unthinkable. He would take the fight beyond the courtroom, beyond the law. He would remove Michael, permanently. The next day, Drew reached out through a secure, encrypted channel to a figure known only by reputation, a contract killer with no ties, no fingerprints, and no mercy. The man was whispered about in elite circles. Someone who executed high-level jobs with surgical precision. Drew didn't ask for details. He didn't care how it was done. All he needed was Michael gone before the custody hearing reached its final verdict. The assassin didn't ask questions either. A number was named. Drew wired the money without hesitation. The weight of his guilt drowned by the roar of his desperation. He told no one. Not Willow, not Rick, not a soul. He carried on with his days, attending court, maintaining the facade of the concerned partner. But beneath the surface, Drew was unraveling. His eyes no longer sparkled with confidence but with something haunted, something primal. He was consumed by a secret so monstrous that even he began to question his own sanity. But each time doubt crept in, he remembered Willow's sobs. He remembered the terror in her voice. And he reminded himself that monsters don't weep for children, only fathers do. He was doing this for her. For them. As the final court date approached, Drew knew the time was near. The assassin had been tracking Michael's routine, studying every moment of his day, every step he took around the gatehouse. The plan was set, during one of Michael's early morning walks with Wiley. A shot would ring out, silent, precise, final. No witnesses, no evidence. Just an empty seat in the courtroom and a default custody ruling in favor of Willow. Drew rehearsed every contingency in his mind, prepared his alibis, and waited. But fate, as always in Port Charles, is rarely cooperative. What Drew could not foresee was the chaos that would erupt when the trigger was pulled. A missed angle, a slight miscalculation, and suddenly sirens were screaming through the air. The assassin escaped, but Michael, wounded, was rushed to General Hospital, his survival hanging by a thread. News of the shooting exploded across town, and suspicion immediately turned inward. Jason, ever watchful, ever mistrusting, sensed something off. He had seen Drew's cold detachment, his obsessive concern with outcomes rather than truth. The investigation began quietly but moved swiftly. Surveillance footage, anonymous tips, financial trails, everything began to point in one direction. And when the authorities finally uncovered the offshore account linked to the payment, Drew's name emerged from the shadows like a curse. Willow's world collapsed the moment police arrived with a warrant. She watched in horror as Drew, her partner, her savior, was handcuffed and led away, his eyes devoid of emotion. Not rage. Not regret. Just silence. What began as a battle for love, for family, had turned into a nightmare soaked in betrayal and blood. Drew had tried to become a protector, but he became a predator instead. And now, as Michael fought for his life and Willow faced the ruin of everything she believed in, one truth stood stark and cold above them all: the war for Wiley and Amelia had cost far more than custody. It had cost their humanity. In the days that followed, Drew continued to present himself at the courthouse with the same mask of stoic detachment, his expression unreadable, his silence calculated and chilling. He sat through every hearing like a statue, never breaking composure, never betraying even the faintest flicker of doubt or guilt. His gaze remained fixed, distant, as though he were operating from a plane beyond the present. His mind already living in the aftermath of the verdict he had orchestrated. To everyone around him, Drew was the embodiment of quiet resilience, a man resolute in his commitment to fight for Willow and her children. Even Willow, the one closest to him, failed to recognize the subtle shifts in his demeanor. She believed he was merely exhausted from the emotional toll of the custody battle, unaware that the man she trusted had crossed a moral threshold from which there was no return. Unbeknownst to her, Drew's plan was nearing its final act. Every detail had been coordinated with clinical precision. The assassin, now embedded within the shadows of Port Charles, had completed his surveillance of Michael's routine. Each morning, Michael would exit the gatehouse for a walk with the children, a vulnerable window, quiet and consistent. Drew monitored these patterns through encrypted messages, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. It was no longer fear that drove him, nor rage, it was obsession, the obsessive belief that his family, his version of right, required the elimination of a man he once called a friend. With each passing hour, the boundaries between right and wrong dissolved further in Drew's mind. He no longer saw Michael as a father with his own pain and rights, but as an obstacle, a threat that had to be removed for the good of the people he loved. He convinced himself that Michael's death would be a mercy, that the children were better off without a man who had once abandoned them, even if that absence was not by choice. Drew's morality had become warped by desperation, and his once rigid sense of justice now answered to one command: protect Willow, no matter the cost. On the day of the planned execution, the sky over Port Charles was smeared with the gray hue of a brewing storm. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes people glance over their shoulders without knowing why. Drew sat in the courtroom that afternoon, his posture rigid, fingers clasped tightly in his lap. Every so often, he checked his watch, though he tried to appear casual. The minutes crawled by. He knew that, by now, the assassin was in position, hidden near the hedges lining the outer edge of the gatehouse property. He imagined the moment, a single silenced shot, a clean exit. And then silence. Finality. Then it happened. A gunshot pierced the air just as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the clouds. It echoed through the gated community like a thunderclap, followed by screams and chaos. Within minutes, sirens blared, and the Port Charles Police Department descended on the scene like a tidal wave. Helicopters hovered above, casting ominous shadows over the neighborhood as law enforcement sealed off every exit point. News of the shooting spread like wildfire, igniting a storm of panic and speculation. The whispers grew louder: someone had tried to assassinate Michael at his home. Carly and Jason rushed to the hospital as Michael, bloodied and unconscious, was wheeled into emergency surgery. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize him, fighting to keep him tethered to life. Willow, upon hearing the news, froze. Her hands trembled violently as her phone slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. Disbelief ravaged her features. Michael had been attacked, nearly killed, and at the gatehouse no less. A place that once represented security and love. She never suspected Drew, not even for a second. Her grief, her confusion, all coalesced into silent agony. She wept for the children, for herself. For the wreckage of a life she no longer understood. But Jason was not as blind. From the moment Michael's body hit the hospital gurney, Jason's instincts sharpened. He had seen the subtle shift in Drew's behavior, the increased tension, the strange silences, the flicker of something too cold in his eyes. He had watched Drew shift from protector to predator, though no one else had dared say it aloud. Now, with Michael clinging to life, Jason allowed his suspicions to take root. He began his own quiet investigation, alerting police to Drew's erratic conduct and pushing for a deeper look into the attack. The formal investigation kicked off within hours of the shooting. The Port Charles police combed through security footage from surrounding homes and traffic cameras. One grainy clip captured a shadowy figure slipping through the hedges behind the gatehouse and disappearing down a maintenance path. That single clue set off a chain reaction. Investigators traced the figure's movement to an alleyway where a black motorcycle had been stashed, abandoned minutes after the shooting. Forensics swept the vehicle and uncovered a burner phone hidden beneath the seat. That burner phone was a goldmine. Encrypted messages and call logs pointed toward a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. That company, in turn, was linked to a series of high-volume offshore bank transfers, payments that coincided exactly with the date Drew had left town briefly under the pretense of meeting with expert witnesses. As investigators followed the money trail, names and aliases emerged, all tying back to a single man, Drew. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. A pattern of secrecy, financial maneuvering, off-the-grid communication. An arrest warrant was issued, and within hours, the police arrived at Drew's residence. He greeted them with the same cold silence he had worn for weeks. No questions. No denials. Just a hollow nod, as if he had long accepted the consequences of what he had done. In his mind, he had already lost everything that mattered, his soul, his identity, and now, the family he believed he was protecting. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the man who once fought valiantly beside the people of Port Charles was now a criminal of the darkest kind. Not for money. Not for revenge. But for love twisted into something unrecognizable. Port Charles stood still in the aftermath. Willow collapsed under the weight of betrayal. Jason watched silently, anger burning behind his eyes. Carly prayed beside Michael's hospital bed, her voice breaking on every whispered plea. And the children, Wiley and Amelia, were shielded from the truth. Too young to understand that the man who once kissed their foreheads goodnight had tried to erase their father from the world. The courtroom would reconvene in the days to come, but not for custody. It would be for justice. For answers. For reckoning. And somewhere in the background, a once heroic man would sit behind bars, alone with the realization that in trying to save a family, he had destroyed it instead. When police finally raided the hidden location where the hired assassin had been lying low, the grim puzzle began falling into place. Among the cache of seized evidence were firearms, forged identification documents, and most damning of all, a burner phone loaded with a series of encrypted calls and text messages. The digital trail was painstakingly unraveled by cybercrime investigators, and the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Drew had orchestrated the attempt on Michael's life. The encrypted calls were traced back to obscure international numbers, routed through offshore accounts, and linked directly to Drew's alias profiles used during his years in covert military operations. What had once been tactics of survival in war zones had now been repurposed for an unforgivable domestic betrayal. The revelation sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the entire legal team. The unmasking of Drew Kane, not as a desperate legal guardian, but as a would-be murderer, sent a chill through every courtroom hallway. As news spread across Port Charles, the collective gasp of the town was palpable. No one had expected such a chilling betrayal from someone who had once been heralded as a protector, a man of duty and principle. But nothing could compare to the devastation that tore through Willow's world the moment the truth was confirmed. To her, Drew had been her pillar, her defender, her partner in grief and rebuilding. She had leaned on him through every storm, trusted him with every fear, even allowed herself to dream of a future where the past no longer haunted them. But now, all those dreams crumbled under the weight of a single truth, that the man she loved had conspired to murder the father of her children. Her breakdown was instant and complete. She fell to her knees in a spiral of disbelief and guilt, wondering how she had failed to see the darkness inside him, how she had let that darkness get so close to Wiley and Amelia. Drew, when arrested, offered no resistance. He was silent, resigned, a man who had already surrendered to the inevitability of justice. There was no rage, no denial. No desperate cries of innocence, only the eerie stillness of a soul that had imploded. His eyes, once sharp with strategic intent and emotional fire, now stared ahead blankly, devoid of anything recognizably human. The courtroom, once a battlefield of hope and defense, had transformed into a stage for humiliation and reckoning. The authorities charged him with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted homicide, and endangering the welfare of children. As he was led away in cuffs, his silence screamed louder than any confession. It was the silence of a man who had crossed every line, broken every bond, and lost every piece of himself in the process. Port Charles was plunged once again into the abyss of scandal, not just because of the failed assassination, but because of the emotional wreckage it exposed. What had started as a fierce but legal custody dispute had evolved into a monstrous betrayal rooted in obsession and delusion. Friends turned away in horror. Allies withdrew in stunned silence. The community reeled from the realization that evil didn't always come from enemies, it sometimes wore the face of those who claimed to love the most. And in the rubble of shattered trust and broken hearts, one truth lingered like ash in the air: no one would ever be the same again. The war over Wiley and Amelia had ended not with a verdict, but with a tragedy so profound that even justice felt hollow. There was no going back, only the long, painful road forward through grief, betrayal, and the shadow of what love had become.